Trapped in an oppressive marriage, Kristen was forced by Brendan to donate blood regularly to save Melanie, his half-sister. Despite her weakened body and growing exhaustion, she gave in to her husband's demands, hoping to be seen and loved. But a devastating revelation changes everything, leaving Brendan drowning in late regret. The sound of rain against the windows of the house in Louisville was almost a relief. For Kristen, absolute silence was unbearable because it meant confronting her own thoughts. The room that had once been her sanctuary now felt like an empty, cold space, reflecting the state of her marriage. Brendan sat in the armchair beside her, focused on his phone, wearing the impassive expression she knew so well. For some reason, his indifference still hurt her, even after all these years. She got up slowly and walked to the kitchen. Opening the fridge, she poured herself a glass of water, while her eyes lingered on the calendar pinned to the door. Tomorrow was another donation day. It was a ritual she followed religiously. Melanie needed her, and Melanie was family. Or at least, that's what she told herself every time she felt the needle pierce her skin. But what truly drove her wasn't just saving Brendan's half-sister's life. It was something deeper, a quiet hope that these sacrifices might be enough to bring back the man she once loved. That night, as Kristen made the bed, Brendan walked into the room without saying a word, took off his shoes and lay down. He didn't even notice when she sighed, feeling the loneliness that followed her even when they were together. Her eyes fixed on the window. Did he know how much she cared? Had he ever cared? The next day at the hospital, Nurse Olivia greeted her with a warm smile. "You're amazing, Kristen. I don't know how you manage to come here every week," she said as she prepared the instruments. Kristen gave a shy smile, feeling a lump in her throat. It was always like this. People saw a strength in her that she herself couldn't feel. "It's just something I have to do," she replied. The truth, however, was more complicated. Every drop of blood she donated felt like a desperate attempt to keep her marriage alive, a gesture of love that Brendan never noticed or reciprocated. She wondered if he even knew her blood type. Back home, she found Brendan on the couch, his eyes glued to the TV. "How's Melanie?" she asked, trying to create a connection. He shrugged, not looking away. "I think she's fine, but she still needs more donations." Kristen felt a pang in her chest. Even after everything, he never asked how she was doing, how the donation process affected her body. He only seemed to see her as a means to an end, not as the woman who sacrificed so much for him. That night, while Brendan slept soundly, Kristen stayed awake. The weight of it all was crushing. She wondered when her life had turned into this, an endless cycle of donations, shattered hopes, and a loneliness that hurt more than any needle. She got out of bed and went to the living room. She picked up an old photo album, something she hadn't done in years. Flipping through its pages, she found images of a time when Brendan smiled beside her, his eyes shining with a love that now felt so distant. They had been happy once, hadn't they? It was hard to believe, but the photos didn't lie. A sudden noise on the stairs interrupted her thoughts. Brendan appeared in the living room, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing up?" "Just thinking," she replied, quickly closing the album. He didn't ask anything else, just went back to the bedroom. And Kristen stayed there, holding the album against her chest, feeling like she alone carried the weight of a love that should have been shared. The next morning, over breakfast, Brendan casually mentioned that Melanie would need more support in the coming months. "I hope you can keep going to the hospital without missing any appointments. They said her recovery depends a lot on it." Kristen paused for a moment, her spoon motionless. His words felt like a blow. He didn't even look at her as he said it, as if her donations were an obligation, an expectation, not the immense sacrifice she made out of love. She wanted to scream. She wanted to ask why he never acknowledged what she did, why he never thanked her, but she didn't. She just lowered her head and finished her coffee in silence. When Brendan left for work, Kristen stayed in the kitchen, staring at the empty cup in front of her. The pain in her chest was no longer just emotional. In recent months, she had felt a growing exhaustion, a weakness that seemed to spread through her entire body, but she ignored it. She couldn't afford to be weak, not when so much was at stake. She got up, grabbed her bag, and went to the garden. The flowers she had planted years ago were still there, but looked more neglected than ever. Just like her, she thought. Kristen ran her fingers over the wilted petals, remembering how she used to care for everything with so much love. But lately, everything seemed to slip through her fingers, including Brendan. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke her thoughts. It was Brendan, who had forgotten something. He rushed out of the car without noticing her. Kristen watched him go into the house and come out minutes later, not once looking her way. As the car disappeared around the corner, tears streamed down Kristen's face. In that moment, she realized something she had been trying to deny. She was losing herself, little by little, in a marriage that only she seemed to be trying to save. And for the first time in a long time, Kristen asked herself, how far would she go for someone who never looked back? The warm Louisville wind stirred the bedroom curtains as Kristen stared at her reflection in the mirror. There was something different about her appearance. Her eyes looked sunken, her face paler. Running her fingers through her hair, she noticed it was thinner, more brittle, but there was no time to dwell on it. The phone rang in the living room, and she already knew who it was before answering. "Kristen, it's Brendan. Melanie had a rough night. Do you think you can move up your next donation to tomorrow?" It was always like this. "No, how are you?" or "Are you feeling well enough for this?" just demands, as if her body were an inexhaustible resource. Kristen gripped the phone tightly, resisting the urge to challenge him. "I'll see what I can do," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. When she hung up, her heart felt heavy. Even when she wasn't physically donating, it seemed like Brendan was draining something even more essential from her: her emotional energy. Later, while preparing lunch, Brendan arrived home early with Melanie. The young woman in her early 30s had a delicate, almost ethereal beauty and a smile that seemed to mask her constant pain. Kristen smiled at her, doing her best to appear welcoming, but she felt a pang of exhaustion at the sight of her. It wasn't Melanie's fault, but Kristen knew that for Brendan, his half-sister's health was his top priority. During lunch, Brendan peppered Melanie with questions about her recovery, about how she was handling her treatments. He even cut her meat into smaller pieces when she mentioned her hands were trembling. Kristen watched the scene, feeling invisible. When was the last time Brendan had done something so thoughtful for her? After lunch, Melanie thanked Kristen for her efforts. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Kristen. I know Brendan appreciates it too, but he didn't. He never did." And in that moment, his silence was louder than any words. Later, after Melanie left, Kristen tried to talk to Brendan. "She seemed better today, didn't she?" "Yes, but it's too early to get optimistic. We have to stay focused. And you need to take care of yourself too. I don't want Melanie to have to rely on anyone else." Those words hit Kristen like a blow. She wasn't the wife anymore, not even a partner. She was a tool in his life, a means to a greater end. She thought about saying something, about yelling until he finally understood, but she held back. Brendan always had a way of minimizing her feelings, of making it seem like she was overreacting. Instead, she just nodded, as she always did. The following days brought an increasing sense of exhaustion. In the laundry room, Kristen dropped a pile of clothes as a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. She leaned against the wall to steady herself, feeling a sharp pain in her left side, something that had been happening more frequently. But she ignored it. Brendan didn't have time to worry about her, and she couldn't afford to appear weak. One particularly quiet night, Kristen tried to rekindle a connection with her husband. Sitting beside him on the couch, she placed a hand on his. He looked at her, surprised, but said nothing. "Brendan, have you ever thought about how this is affecting me? Not just physically, but emotionally?" He frowned as if she were unfairly accusing him. "You've always been strong, Kristen. I didn't ask you to do this. It was your decision." The words cut deeply, and Kristen pulled her hand away. She wanted to scream that she was doing it for him, for Melanie, for the family she was desperately trying to hold together. But instead, she got up and went to the bedroom, the lump in her throat growing heavier. That night, alone in bed, Kristen wondered if Brendan would ever understand, or if she was doomed to remain an invisible presence in his life, a shadow of a love he seemed to have forgotten. The next day, as she left the hospital after another donation, Olivia called her back. "Kristen, you look paler than usual. Are you okay?" Kristen hesitated. Olivia's concern was genuine, and it touched her in an unexpected way. "I'm fine, just tired maybe." Olivia studied her for a moment, as if sensing there was more to it. "You know donating so often can be dangerous, right? Your body needs time to recover." Kristen nodded but said nothing. There was no room for her to prioritize herself, not when so much depended on her. That evening, while watering the garden, Brendan stepped onto the porch, talking on the phone. Kristen couldn't help but overhear. "Yes, I know she needs to keep donating. Don't worry, Melanie will be fine." His words were so practical, so detached. He didn't even mention Kristen by name, as if she were just a piece of the puzzle. When he hung up, Kristen approached him. "You're worried about Melanie, but have you thought about what might happen to me?" Brendan sighed, clearly exasperated. "Kristen, why do you always try to make this about you? Don't you think Melanie has enough problems already?" She felt the tears burn her eyes but refused to cry, not in front of him. Without another word, she turned and went back inside, feeling more isolated than ever. As she climbed the stairs, another wave of pain made her stop. She clutched the railing, taking deep breaths until it passed. Her hands were damp, and she realized she was sweating. When she finally reached the bedroom, she sat on the bed trying to ignore the discomfort. She knew something was wrong, but admitting it out loud would mean acknowledging weakness, and she couldn't afford that. Not while Brendan remained distant, and Melanie still needed her. The morning began under the grey sky of Louisville, a dense layer of clouds mirroring exactly how Kristen felt inside. As she drove to the hospital for a routine checkup, the exhaustion felt heavier than ever. Over the past few months, she had been ignoring the signs: frequent dizziness, constant pain in her left side, and a fatigue that made each day harder to bear. But the recent intensity of her symptoms had finally forced her to schedule the appointment. Sitting in the waiting room, she absent-mindedly twisted the rings on her fingers, watching the nurses and patients move about. Everything felt so mechanical, so distant, as if it were a reality she didn't want to face. When the office door opened, the doctor, a woman with a firm but compassionate demeanor, called her in. "Kristen, let's take a look at these results." Kristen entered the office, her heart pounding. She sat in the cushioned yet uncomfortable chair, watching as the doctor flipped through the papers on her clipboard. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she finally spoke. "The tests show something concerning. You have a mass on your left kidney. We conducted more detailed scans, and it's advanced kidney cancer." The words hung in the air as if the world had stopped for a moment. Kristen blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as the weight of the news began to sink in. "Advanced," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor nodded, her expression empathetic. "Yes, it's aggressive, and given your recent history of frequent blood donations, your body is under significant stress. That may have accelerated the disease's progression." Kristen felt a lump in her throat but forced herself to stay composed. "So, what now? What do I do?" "We'll start planning treatments immediately, but I need to be honest with you. Your condition is serious. Every decision from here on needs to be made carefully, including prioritizing your health." Those words struck deep. Prioritize her health. When was the last time she'd done that? Everything she did was for others, for Brendan, for Melanie. And now she was facing a battle entirely on her own. On the drive home, Kristen couldn't stop silent tears from streaming down her face. She parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the house she had built with Brendan, a place that should have been her sanctuary. But at that moment, it felt like a prison. When she walked inside, Brendan was in the living room working on his laptop. He glanced up briefly, only to ask a casual question. "How was the hospital? Everything good to keep up with the donations?" Kristen swallowed hard, feeling indignation rise within her. He hadn't even asked if she was okay, if anything concerning had come up in her tests. It wasn't surprising, but it still hurt. "Everything's fine," she lied. She didn't have the courage to tell him. Not yet. The days that followed blurred together. The physical pain seemed sharper now that she knew what she was facing, but the emotional weight was heavier. Kristen spent her days debating what to do. Should she tell Brendan? He wasn't exactly a man of warmth or support. Would he see her illness as a burden? Something that would push him even further away? One evening, while Brendan watched TV, Kristen decided to try an indirect approach. "Have you ever thought about what would happen if I weren't here?" He turned to her, puzzled. "What do you mean? You're here, aren't you?" Kristen pressed her lips together, struggling with the urge to say everything. "Never mind. Forget it." But he persisted. "Are you okay, Kristen? You seem more tired than usual." For a moment, she thought she might tell him. But then he added, "If you need to rest more before the donations, that's fine. Just let me know." That was enough to silence her. He wasn't worried about her, only about what she represented in Melanie's recovery. The next day, during another hospital visit, Nurse Olivia, who was familiar with Kristen, noticed something different. "Are you feeling okay? You look more worn out than usual." Kristen tried to smile. "I'm fine, Olivia, just a little tired." But Olivia wasn't convinced. "Listen, I know it's not my place, but you're always sacrificing for everyone else. Have you thought about taking care of yourself?" Those words struck a chord deep within Kristen. She wanted to scream that she didn't know how to do that her entire life revolved around Brendan and his expectations. After the appointment, Kristen returned home with a decision. She wouldn't tell Brendan, at least not yet. He wouldn't understand, and she wasn't ready to face the rejection she knew would follow. But deep down, she knew hiding the truth would only delay the inevitable. In the days that followed, Kristen began quietly preparing for the worst without saying it aloud. She organized documents and wrote letters that no one would read yet. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the loneliness grow stronger with each passing day. Brendan was there physically, but emotionally, he felt miles away. One night, when a new wave of pain hit her, Kristen got out of bed and went to the mirror. She stared at her reflection for a long time, seeing a woman who looked like a shadow of who she once was. And for the first time, she wondered if her fight to save her marriage was worth it. Alone, gazing at her reflection, Kristen realized something terrifying. It wasn't just Brendan who didn't see her. She didn't see herself anymore either. The morning began like any other in Kristen and Brendan's house. She dragged herself out of bed, her movements slower than ever. The pain in her left side had become a constant companion, an uncomfortable reminder of what she was facing alone. While preparing breakfast, she felt her breathing grow heavy, as though her body's weight was too much to bear. Brendan entered the kitchen with his usual apathetic expression, scrolling through his phone as he sipped his coffee. "You remember tomorrow's donation, right?" he asked without looking up. "Yes," Kristen replied automatically. But inside, anger began to simmer. It was always about that, the donations. Never about her, never about how she felt or what she needed. Why didn't he see it? Kristen spent the day trying to complete her daily chores, but every small movement felt like a battle. While tidying up the living room, a sharp wave of pain hit her like a blow. She dropped the vase she was holding, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the empty room. Clutching the sofa to keep from collapsing, she took deep breaths, trying to calm her body. Later, when Brendan returned home, he noticed the shards still scattered on the floor. "What happened here?" "I dropped the vase. It was an accident. You should have cleaned it up before someone got hurt," he said casually, as he walked past her to the bedroom. Kristen didn't respond. She didn't have the energy to argue or the strength to explain that, in that moment, she could barely stand. The next morning, Kristen dragged herself to the hospital for another donation. She knew her body was at its limit, but the thought of saying no was unthinkable. If she didn't help, who would? That question always haunted her. Olivia greeted her as usual, but there was a different look in the nurse's eyes this time. "Kristen, you look exhausted. Are you sure you're okay to donate today?" "I'm fine. Just a tough week," Kristen lied, avoiding Olivia's gaze. But during the procedure, something went wrong. The dizziness she'd been experiencing morphed into overwhelming vertigo. Suddenly the world spun, and the last thing she saw before everything went dark was Olivia's worried face, calling her name. When she woke up, Kristen was lying on a hospital bed, Olivia by her side, holding her hand. "You fainted, Kristen. That's not normal. It's time to stop ignoring what's happening." Kristen tried to smile, but it was a futile effort. "I'm just tired. I'll be fine." Olivia shook her head, clearly frustrated. "I've heard that from too many patients, but I can tell there's more going on here. And I'll ask you directly, are you taking care of yourself? Because frankly, it doesn't look like it." Olivia's words hit Kristen like a slap. It was the first time in months that someone genuinely seemed to care about her, to see beyond the facade. Kristen felt her eyes well up, but held back the tears. "It's not that simple, Olivia." "Then explain it to me. Who's demanding so much from you? Is it your husband?" Kristen hesitated. She didn't want to betray Brendan or expose her situation to an outsider, but at the same time, she felt an overwhelming need to unburden herself. "I do it for Melanie. She needs me. And Brendan, he thinks I can handle it." "And do you think you can handle it?" Olivia asked, her voice filled with compassion. Kristen didn't answer. Instead, she looked away, her throat tightening. After a few moments of silence, Olivia spoke again. "Kristen, you can't keep ignoring your body. I've seen too many patients face hard battles because they waited too long to ask for help. Don't let that happen to you." When Kristen returned home that evening, she found Brendan in the living room arguing with someone on the phone. It was obvious the conversation was about Melanie. He hung up as soon as he saw her enter. "You're late. Everything okay with the donation?" Kristen nodded, avoiding his eyes. She climbed the stairs and went into the bedroom, locking the door behind her. Sitting on the bed, she felt the weight of her conversation with Olivia. For the first time, she began to question whether she was right to keep her illness a secret. But how could she tell Brendan? He never even asked how she was doing. That night, while Brendan slept, Kristen got up and began writing a letter. She wasn't sure who it was for. Perhaps for him, perhaps for Melanie, perhaps only for herself. The words poured out like a flood of bottled emotions. "I don't know how much time I have left. What I do know is that I've done everything I could to hold this family together, to help you, to help Melanie. But I'm losing myself in the process. I wanted you to see that, to see me. But maybe it's too late for that." She stopped writing, unable to continue. Tears stained the paper as the exhaustion overtook her again. That night, Kristen fell asleep with the unfinished letter by her side, feeling time slipping through her fingers like sand. And for the first time, she began to think about what it would mean to prioritize herself, and what might happen if she didn't. That morning, Kristen woke earlier than usual. The bedroom was bathed in a muted twilight, the grey dawn light filtering through the half-open curtains. She stayed in bed for a few minutes, feeling the heaviness in her body, every movement requiring an almost superhuman effort. Since her conversation with Olivia, something within her had shifted. It was as though a mirror had been placed before her, forcing her to confront the reality she had ignored for so long. She was dying, slowly and silently, and no one seemed to notice. Brendan was still asleep beside her, his face serene, oblivious to the storm of thoughts tormenting Kristen. She watched him for a moment, trying to remember the man he used to be, the man she had fallen in love with. But all she felt now was a mixture of sadness and emptiness. He didn't see her anymore. Perhaps he never truly had. Careful not to wake him, she got up and went downstairs. In the kitchen, she placed the kettle on the stove and waited for the water to boil. Meanwhile, she picked up the letter she had started writing the night before and reread every word. A lump formed in her throat as she realized these words were more than just a vent. They were a silent cry for help, for validation. The kettle whistled, and Kristen poured the water into her mug, watching the steam rise in a slow, hypnotic dance. Her mind raced, Olivia's advice echoing in her head. "You can't keep ignoring your body." It was a simple truth, yet terrifying. She knew she had to do something, but what? Tell Brendan, confront him, or simply give up and surrender to the exhaustion consuming every piece of her soul. That morning, she made her first decision. She would return to the doctor and begin treatment, alone, if necessary. She could no longer ignore the seriousness of her condition. If Brendan wasn't willing to fight for her, she would fight for herself. But before that, there was something more urgent. Kristen needed to understand what kept her in this marriage, what made her cling to a man who seemed incapable of seeing her pain. When Brendan finally came downstairs for breakfast, Kristen was sitting at the table, the letter carefully folded in her lap. She considered handing it to him right then, but she hesitated. Brendan seemed rushed, talking on the phone as he grabbed a piece of toast. He didn't meet her eyes or ask how she was. "I need to head to work early today," he said quickly. "Can you check with the hospital if Melanie needs anything else?" Kristen clutched the letter tightly in her lap, feeling a mix of anger and resignation. He didn't even notice the emotional weight hanging over her. "Sure," she responded mechanically. When Brendan left, the door slamming behind him, the silence of the house enveloped her like a heavy blanket. She knew she couldn't live like this any longer. Determined, she grabbed her bag and drove to the hospital to see Olivia. The nurse greeted her with the same compassion as always, but immediately noticed something different. Kristen seemed more resolute, though the weight of exhaustion still clung to her. "I want to start treatment," Kristen said directly, "and I want it to be discreet." Olivia frowned, clearly concerned. "Discreet? Kristen, you need support. This isn't something you can face alone." Kristen looked away, shame washing over her. "I know, but Brendan doesn't understand. He won't understand. And I don't want this to affect Melanie." "And what about you?" Olivia asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Who's taking care of you, Kristen?" Kristen didn't respond. She just sighed, feeling tears threaten to fall. "Okay," Olivia said finally. "We'll start, but I need you to promise me something. Don't shut yourself off completely. You need someone by your side, even if it's not your husband. Kristen nodded, though she wasn't sure how she could keep that promise. In the days that followed, Kristen began crafting a routine to balance her treatment with the responsibilities Brendan expected of her. Chemotherapy was draining, but she didn't want him to notice. She always made it home before he arrived, cleaned the house, cooked dinner, and pretended everything was normal. But as the treatment progressed, hiding the side effects became increasingly difficult. Her body grew frailer, and the pain was relentless. One evening, while preparing dinner, she dropped a hot pan, burning her hand. Her cry of pain brought Brendan rushing into the kitchen. "What happened?" he asked, alarmed. "It was an accident," Kristen said, trying to hide her swelling hand. Brendan frowned. "You've been distracted lately. Are you sure you're okay?" For a moment, Kristen almost told him everything, but something in Brendan's expression stopped her. He looked concerned, but it was a practical concern, almost distant, like he was trying to solve a problem rather than truly connect with her. "I'm fine," she lied again. But that night, while Brendan slept, Kristen couldn't hold back her tears. She knew she couldn't continue like this. She was destroying herself for someone who seemed incapable of loving her the way she needed. The next day, Kristen made a second major decision. She would confront Brendan. Not about her illness, not yet, but about how she had been feeling. She needed to know if there was still something worth fighting for. When Brendan came home from work that evening, she was waiting for him in the living room, the letter she had written now in her hands. He looked at her curiously, but failed to notice the tension in the air. "Can we talk?" Kristen asked, her voice steady but trembling slightly at the edges. "Of course. What's wrong?" Kristen took a deep breath and began. "Brendan, I need to know just what are we now, because honestly I don't know anymore." Brendan looked confused. "What do you mean? We're husband and wife." "But we don't act like it," she countered, her voice growing stronger. "I've sacrificed so much, not just for Melanie, but for you. And in return I feel invisible, like I only exist to solve your problems." Brendan was silent for a moment, clearly caught off guard. "Kristen, you're overreacting. I appreciate everything you do. Would you still appreciate it if I stopped?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly. He didn't answer. The silence that followed was deafening, and Kristen felt her heart sink. Without another word, she stood and walked to the bedroom, leaving Brendan alone in the living room, lost in thoughts that would likely never be deep enough to grasp the extent of what she felt. That night, Kristen cried alone, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of something different. It wasn't quite hope, but a faint flicker of self-compassion, a reminder that her life had value beyond what Brendan saw in her. And as sleep finally claimed her, Kristen realized she was, for the first time, fighting for herself, even if it meant facing everything alone. The sky over Louisville was overcast that morning, mirroring the weight Kristen carried on her shoulders. Every movement felt exhausting, but she was determined to break the cycle of silence. Since her conversation with Brendan the night before, something inside her had shifted. She knew she needed to confront him again, but this time she wouldn't let the conversation be dismissed with his usual hollow excuses. While preparing breakfast, she felt the familiar sharp pain in her left side, a cruel reminder that time was against her. But Kristen was resolute. He needed to know. He needed to understand what she was facing, even if it changed nothing. When Brendan came downstairs, he seemed distracted, checking emails on his phone as he grabbed a cup of coffee. Kristen watched him for a moment, searching for the man who had once been her greatest source of comfort. But all she saw now was someone distant, oblivious to the weight she carried alone. "Brendan, can we talk before you leave?" He glanced at her briefly, still holding his phone. "Sure, but it'll have to be quick. I'm running late." Kristen took a deep breath, trying to control the mix of nerves and frustration building inside her. "This is serious, Brendan. Please, sit down." Something in her tone made him pause. He closed his phone and sat at the table, though his expression showed impatience. I need to talk about us, about what's happening to me." He frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Kristen wrung her hands, trying to summon courage. "I've been feeling unwell for months. I've ignored the symptoms because I was focused on Melanie and on what you needed from me. But I can't pretend I'm okay anymore." Brendan leaned forward, but not with the concern she had hoped for. There was skepticism in his eyes. "Are you trying to tell me you're sick? Is that it?" Kristen nodded, feeling tears well up. "I've been diagnosed with advanced kidney cancer." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Brendan leaned back in his chair, processing what she had just said. For a moment, Kristen thought he might react with compassion, that he might finally see what she was enduring. But then he spoke. "And what does this mean for the donations? Can you still help Melanie?" His words hit like a blow, knocking the air out of Kristen's lungs. She stared at him, stunned. "That's all you have to say? I just told you I have cancer, and all you care about is whether I can still donate." Brendan raised his hands defensively. "That's not what I meant. I'm just trying to figure out how this affects everything." "How it affects you, you mean?" Kristen shot back, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "Because apparently, I don't matter. Only what I can do for you and your sister." Brendan stood, clearly uncomfortable. "Kristen, it's not fair to throw this at me right now. I'm just trying to process this." "And how do you think I feel?" she yelled, the tears finally spilling over. "I've been dealing with all of this alone because you were never there for me. I loved you, Brendan. I gave everything for you, and it meant nothing." He stayed silent, his expression tense. "I think you're overreacting." Those words were the final straw. Kristen grabbed her bag and left the house, feeling like she couldn't breathe in that environment anymore. She drove aimlessly for a while before heading to the hospital for yet another donation, against Olivia's advice and her own better judgment. When she arrived, Olivia greeted her with a concerned look. "Kristen, you shouldn't be here. Your body isn't in any condition for this." "I don't have a choice," Kristen replied, avoiding Olivia's gaze. During the procedure, Kristen felt the world begin to spin. Her breathing grew heavy, and a sharp pain shot through her body. Before she could alert anyone, everything went black. When she woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed, Olivia by her side. "You fainted, Kristen. This can't go on. Your body is crying out for help, and you're ignoring it." A short while later, Brendan arrived at the hospital. He looked concerned, but the first thing he asked was, "Does this mean Melanie won't get her donation?" Olivia, who had remained silent until then, couldn't contain her indignation. "Are you serious? Your wife just fainted from exhaustion and all you can think about is someone else?" Brendan stared at her, surprised by her boldness. "I just want to make sure my sister has what she needs." "And who's making sure Kristen has what she needs?" Olivia countered firmly. Kristen watched the scene with a heavy heart. For the first time, she saw Brendan clearly, the man he had become, or perhaps the man he had always been. And for the first time, she began to accept that he might never change. When Brendan returned home that night, Kristen stayed in the bedroom, avoiding him entirely. She knew she needed to make a difficult decision, continue sacrificing everything for a love that was destroying her, or finally start fighting for herself. As the silence of the night enveloped the house, Kristen felt a new determination growing within her. She didn't know exactly what she would do, but one thing was certain: something had to change. The silence in Kristen's house was almost tangible. Since the incident at the hospital, an even greater distance had settled between her and Brendan. He seemed lost in thought but made no effort to share them. Kristen, meanwhile, withdrew further into herself, acutely aware that she couldn't continue living this way. The decision to prioritize herself hadn't come easily, but it had become inevitable. She started with small steps. She stopped immediately attending to Brendan's demands, even though it filled her with guilt. She began using the days when he was at work to care for herself, medical appointments, rest, and quiet moments alone. There was an emptiness in these attempts to reconnect with herself, but it hurt less than trying to connect with someone who felt unreachable. One evening, while Brendan was on the couch watching TV, Kristen watched him from the kitchen. He was there physically, but as distant as ever. She felt an urgency to speak with him, to try one more time. Grabbing a glass of water, she crossed the room and stood in front of him. "Can we talk?" He paused the TV and looked at her, confused. "Sure. What is it now?" The question, loaded with impatience, already felt like a blow. Kristen took a deep breath. "I need you, Brendan, more than ever. But honestly, I don't know if you still care." He frowned, irritated. "Of course I care. I just don't understand why you always make me the bad guy." Kristen felt tears well up in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Because I feel alone, Brendan. Because you never ask how I'm doing, never care about what I'm going through. You're not here." He was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words, but instead of acknowledging her pain, he shrugged. "I've got a lot on my mind, Kristen. It's not easy for me either." His response was like a door slamming in her face. Kristen felt something inside her break, a final hope dissipating. Without another word, she stood and went to the bedroom, leaving Brendan with his indifference. The next morning, as Kristen watered the flowers in the garden, the phone rang. She answered, and the grave voice of the hospital doctor greeted her. "Kristen, I'm sorry to call you with this news, but Melanie passed away this morning. We did everything we could, but her body just couldn't hold on." The world seemed to stop. Kristen felt the phone slip in her hand, but managed to catch it before it fell. The news was a shock, but what truly unsettled her was how Brendan would react. She knew he would blame her, even if he didn't say it outright. When Brendan arrived home that afternoon, Kristen was already seated in the living room waiting for him. As soon as he walked in, she saw the worry on his face. The hospital called. "Melanie." "I know," Kristen interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "I'm so sorry, Brendan." He seemed to crumble before her, something Kristen had never seen. He fell onto the couch, his hands covering his face. "I should have done more. I should have been there for her." Kristen watched him, feeling a mix of empathy and exhaustion. "You did what you could," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her. That night, Brendan approached Kristen in a way he hadn't in years. He sat beside her on the bed, took her hand and said, "I'm sorry for how I've been. Losing Melanie made me realize how much I've neglected you. I want to make things right." For a brief moment, Kristen almost believed him, but as she looked into his eyes, she realized something was missing. It wasn't genuine remorse. It was guilt. He wasn't trying to reconnect with her. He was trying to ease the weight of his own failures. "Brendan, I don't think you understand what you're saying," Kristen replied, her voice calm but weary. "You say you want to make things right now, but you don't know what that means. You don't know because you've never really seen me." He started to argue, but Kristen raised her hand, stopping him. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I need to be honest. I need to be honest with myself." That night, Kristen slept in the guest bedroom. For the first time, it wasn't to avoid Brendan, but because she needed space to breathe, to think about what came next. In the days that followed, Brendan made an effort to be more present, but his attempts felt strained. He brought her coffee, asked how she was feeling, and tried to engage her in small ways, but everything rang hollow. Kristen could see he was trying, but she also knew it was too late. Something fundamental had shifted, something that couldn't be repaired. As Kristen reflected on her life and the choices that had led her to this moment, she realized she was finally ready to put herself first. Not out of spite for Brendan, but because she knew she couldn't keep waiting for him to change. She didn't have time to wait any longer. The afternoon was quiet, but the tension was palpable. Kristen knew she could no longer postpone the final confrontation with Brendan. There was something definitive about how she felt that day, as if an invisible line had been drawn between the past and the future. She was exhausted, her body increasingly fragile, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been. Brendan was in the living room watching a documentary, though Kristen could tell his attention was superficial. He spent his days trying to fill the void Melanie had left, but nothing seemed to help. He didn't talk about his pain, nor did he leave space for Kristen to share hers. Kristen entered the room with a calmness that belied the storm she carried inside. She sat on the couch next to Brendan and turned off the TV with the remote before he could protest. "We need to talk, Brendan." He frowned, clearly unprepared for yet another serious conversation. "All right. About what?" Kristen clasped her trembling hands in her lap, forcing her voice to stay steady. "About us. About what I've been carrying alone all this time." Brendan leaned back on the couch, crossing his arms defensively. "Kristen, I told you I'm trying. I know I've made mistakes, but you have to give me time." "Time," Kristen repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Time for what, Brendan? To realize that I exist? To notice that I have a disease that's killing me while you pretend everything is fine?" He opened his mouth to respond, but she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Do you know how many times I've put myself second for you? How many nights I cried alone because you were too busy with what mattered to you? I gave my blood, my health, my entire life to try to save Melanie because I believed it would save us. But it was never enough, was it?" Brendan stared at her, her words finally seeming to hit him. He shook his head, as if denying what he was hearing. "That's not true, Kristen. I care. I've always cared." "No, Brendan. You cared about what I could do for you. about what I could offer, but me, as a person, as your wife, you never cared enough. The tears finally came, hot and uncontrollable, but Kristen didn't try to hide them. I loved you with everything I had. I destroyed myself for you, and now I have nothing left. Brendan looked lost, as if hearing her words for the first time. He reached out for her, but Kristen stood, her legs shaking. This isn't all your fault, Brendan. I let this happen. I lost myself trying to be everything for you, but this has to end. Suddenly, Kristen felt a sharp pain in her left side, so intense it made her stagger. Brendan quickly stood and caught her before she collapsed. Kristen, what's happening? She struggled to breathe, clutching her side as the pain worsened. I need to go to the hospital. Without hesitation, Brendan helped her to the car. The drive to the hospital was a blur of lights and sounds, the pain consuming Kristen with every passing moment. When they arrived, Olivia was already waiting, her face a mask of concern. She's deteriorating, Olivia said, as the medical team wheeled Kristen into the emergency room. Brendan tried to follow, but he was stopped at the door. He stood frozen in the hallway, his hands in his hair, his eyes filled with panic. For the first time, he seemed to truly grasp the gravity of the situation. Hours passed, and Brendan remained in the waiting room, his face buried in his hands. Kristen's words echoed in his mind, every sacrifice she had made, every moment he had left her alone. He realized far too late that everything she had done was out of love, a love he had never reciprocated in the way she deserved. When Olivia finally emerged, her expression was serious. She's very weak, Brendan. We'll do everything we can, but you need to be prepared. He nodded, the weight of guilt crushing him. Can I see her? Olivia hesitated, then nodded. Just for a few minutes. Brendan entered the room, and the sight before him shattered something inside. Kristen lay pale and frail, tubes and machines attached to her body. Her eyes were closed, but as he approached and took her hand, she opened them slowly. Kristen, he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. I'm so sorry. For everything. I never realized how much you were suffering. I was selfish, blind. But I love you, Kristen. I always have. She gave him a faint, sad smile. Brendan, I waited so long to hear that, but you're only saying it now because you're afraid of losing me. He shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. No, I want to make this right. I want to be here for you. Kristen squeezed his hand weakly. I know you believe that now. But Brendan, I don't know if I have any time left. His tears fell freely as she closed her eyes again, her body too exhausted to continue. Brendan stayed by her side, holding her hand, feeling the crushing weight of what he had lost. He realized then that everything she had said was true. He loved her, but he had only truly seen her when it was already too late. The sky over Louisville hung heavy on the day of Melanie's funeral. A light drizzle fell over the cemetery, as if the city itself mourned the loss. Brendan stood near the casket, surrounded by family and friends, but the emptiness inside him was overwhelming. He couldn't focus on the pastor's words or the murmurs of condolences around him. Brendan's mind was fixed on Kristen, who remained in the hospital fighting for every breath as he said goodbye to his sister. Each recent memory unfolded like a knife, twisting deeper into his chest. Kristen's words echoed incessantly, every sacrifice she had made, every moment he had neglected her. He had tried to justify his actions countless times, but every excuse now felt hollow. He could no longer deny that he had failed her. As the crowd began to disperse, Brendan stayed behind, staring at the freshly placed headstone. A hand rested on his shoulder, but he didn't turn to see who it was. I'm so sorry for your loss, someone said, but the words felt distant. Loss. The word now seemed omnipresent in his life. After the funeral, Brendan drove straight to the hospital. He didn't know what he would find, but knew he needed to be there. When he arrived, Olivia was waiting at the reception desk, her face tired and solemn. How is she? Brendan asked, his voice heavy with fear. Olivia hesitated, a compassionate look crossing her face. Brendan, Anne Kristen is very weak. We don't know how much time she has left. The floor seemed to drop out from under him. I need to see her. Olivia led him to Kristen's room. Brendan entered slowly, the rhythmic beeping of the machines monitoring her vital signs filling the air. She looked even paler than before, her body small and fragile against the white sheets. Her eyes were closed, but they opened slowly at the sound of his footsteps. You came back, Kristen said, her voice weak but tinged with a serenity that disarmed him. "I never should have left," Brendan replied, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. Kristen smiled faintly, a gentle, almost resigned expression. "It's okay, we don't need to pretend anymore, Brendan. I know I did everything I could, and that's enough." "No, Kristen," he said, his voice breaking. "You did more than anyone could ever do. I'm the one who failed. I loved you, but I never showed it. I never told you. I was selfish, blind, but I see it now. I see you. Please forgive me." She looked at him, her eyes filled with an understanding he didn't deserve. "I forgave you a long time ago, Brendan. My love for you, it was never about what you did or didn't do, but now you need to learn to forgive yourself." Tears streamed down his face as Kristen closed her eyes again, exhausted. Brendan stayed there, holding her hand, silently begging for more time. But deep down he knew it was too. That night, Kristen passed away peacefully, surrounded by Brendan's presence but far from the life she had dreamed of. The days that followed were a blur of grief and regret for Brendan. He arranged Kristen's funeral with Olivia's help, her quiet support guiding him through a process he didn't know how to navigate. At the service, he was surrounded by people who spoke of Kristen with a reverence that crushed him further. "She was incredible, wasn't she?" one of Kristen's friends said. "So generous, so dedicated. She would do anything for the people she loved." Brendan nodded, unable to respond. He knew those words were true, but he also knew he had never truly appreciated them while he had the chance. At the end of the day, Brendan returned home alone. The house was empty now, every corner a painful reminder of what he had lost. On the living room table lay the photo album Kristen used to look through. He flipped through the pages slowly, seeing her smiling in every picture, moments of happiness that now felt impossibly distant. In the bedroom, he found the unfinished letter she had written. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I don't know how much time I have left, but I know I did everything I could to love and support you. My greatest wish was always that you would see me, recognize me for who I am, not for what I could do for you. If you're reading this, I hope you find the peace I never could." Brendan fell to his knees, clutching the letter to his chest as tears poured freely. For the first time, he truly saw Kristen, her struggles, her unconditional love, her sacrifices, but it was too late to give her the love she deserved. In the days that followed, Brendan tried to find purpose, some meaning to carry on. He began spending time in the garden Kristen had nurtured, trying to keep the flowers alive as a tribute to her. Each act felt like a small attempt at redemption, though he knew it could never erase what he had done or failed to do. Now, every corner of the house was a silent memorial to Kristen's love, a love he had never learned to reciprocate while she was alive. Brendan knew he would carry the weight of that loss for the rest of his days, but he also knew her memory deserved more than his regret. Kristen had gone, but her final words echoed in his mind. "True love doesn't demand sacrifices that destroy us, but those that bring us together." As mornings in Louisville followed their own rhythm, a peculiar silence broken only by the distant sound of birds and the occasional rustling of trees. For Brendan, that silence had become almost unbearable. Every morning, he woke up with a hollow sensation that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. Kristen's absence was a constant weight. The bed felt larger, her clothes still hung in the closet, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of her presence. Brendan often found himself walking to the guest room where she had slept during her final weeks, as if he might find her there, sitting on the edge of the bed, ready to offer him a tired but genuine smile. But the room was empty. So was he. Brendan spent most days trying to fill the time. He had returned to work, but the hours that once passed quickly now dragged on, each pause between meetings or tasks filled with thoughts of Kristen. He began spending weekends in the garden, tending to the flowers she had loved so much. At first it was a way to honor her memory, but over time it became something more, a way to feel connected to her, to believe that a part of Kristen was still alive among the vibrant petals and soft fragrances. One particularly hot afternoon, Brendan was kneeling in the garden pulling weeds when he discovered a small notebook tucked among the flower pots. It was Kristen's journal, something he had never known she kept. He hesitated before opening it, feeling as though he was intruding on something deeply personal, but curiosity got the better of him. The pages were filled with thoughts, feelings, and reflections she had never shared. There were entries about the internal battles she faced, her efforts to keep their marriage alive, and the love she felt for Brendan despite everything. "Today he smiled at me during breakfast," she had written on one page. "It was just a small gesture, but it gave me hope. Maybe he still sees me." Tears streamed down Brendan's face as he read. He realized how many of those small moments he had failed to notice, how she clung to crumbs of affection while he remained oblivious to the monumental effort she put into keeping their love alive. Later, sitting in the living room with Kristen's journal in his lap, Brendan reflected on his choices, on how he had allowed routine, responsibilities, and his own insecurities to cloud his vision. He had always thought there was time, that he could fix things tomorrow, next week, next year. But tomorrow had never come. He remembered something Olivia had said to him at the hospital after Kristen's death. "She was extraordinary, Brendan. Not because of what she did for you or for Melanie, but because of the love she carried. It was so immense that she didn't even need it to be reciprocated to keep loving." Those words echoed in his mind as he gazed out the window at the garden. He realized with painful clarity that Kristen had never demanded perfection from him. All she ever wanted was to be seen, to be recognized as the woman who gave everything she had to keep their love alive. On a particularly lonely night, Brendan walked through the house, moving from room to room as if seeing them for the first time. Every object, every piece of furniture held a memory of her. The armchair in the living room where she read her favorite books, the kitchen where she lovingly prepared meals, the painting on the wall she had chosen because it brought life to the space. Eventually, Brendan stopped in front of a photo of the two of them, taken early in their marriage. His arm was around her, and they were both smiling at the camera. In that moment, he wondered, how many times had he let her love go unnoticed? How often had he ignored the quiet gestures she made to hold them together? How many times do we let love go unnoticed? The question lingered in his mind as he finally sat on the couch, the weight of guilt and regret pressing down on him. He knew he would never have an answer, just as he knew nothing he did now could bring her back. But Brendan also knew he couldn't let Kristen's legacy fade. He resolved to live in a way that honored her love, to make her sacrifices mean something, not for redemption, but because she deserved that much. The next morning, Brendan went to the garden and planted a new flower, one Kristen had mentioned in her journal as her favorite. He cared for it as a silent promise, a reminder that true love doesn't demand sacrifices that destroy us, but ones that inspire us to be better. As the sun rose over Louisville, Brendan felt a melancholic calm settle over him. He knew he would never fully overcome the loss, but he would carry Kristen's memory with him, a silent beacon in the darkness he had created. And so, the love he had never learned to cherish in life became the compass he used to navigate his way forward. Have you ever stopped to think about how much someone might be silently sacrificing for you? Now tell me, what would you do if you found out too late? Leave your answer in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you missed the last story we shared here on the channel, here's what happened. Betrayed, run over, and fighting for her life, Lisa embarks on a journey that will change her forever. After catching her husband Charles in a devastating affair with the maid, Lisa storms out in shock and suffers a severe accident. At the hospital, unconscious and vulnerable, she battles for survival, unaware that a new danger is closing in. Charles, fearing the consequences of his infidelity being exposed, is planning an even crueler act. Click the video now appearing on your screen to uncover the full story behind this gripping tale. See you there.